The rusted car rolled into the parking lot of the Apex Invitational, the most prestigious automotive showcase in the country, and the laughter from the VIP enclosure started before the engine even cut off. Paint had peeled from the body in broad, uneven strips, exposing bare metal beneath like old scar tissue. A crack ran diagonally across the windshield from the lower left corner to the upper right. The rear license plate hung at an angle, held by a single trembling bolt. Elijah stepped out, reached back, and took Grace's hand as she slid from the passenger seat, a 6-year-old, clutching a stuffed rabbit against her chest with both arms. He walked forward without hesitation. Diana, who had arrived earlier in a convoy of black SUVs and had just signed the paperwork on a $9 million limited edition coupe, parked 3 spaces to the left, looked at the car, then at the man, and allowed a slow, measured smile to cross her face. "I think you have the wrong address," she said, loud enough for those nearby to hear. "The salvage yard is on 12, about 3 miles back." Elijah did not answer. He walked to the front of the car and lifted the hood. "Stay with this story, it will hold you from the very first word to the very last." The alarm on Elijah's phone read 5:30 when he silenced it without opening his eyes. The apartment was small, 2 bedrooms on the outer edge of Detroit's western suburbs, and before he was fully awake, he could hear the refrigerator cycling in the kitchen and, through the thin walls, the distant early morning freight line 3 blocks east. He pressed his palms to his knees and stood. The kitchen light buzzed faintly when it first switched on, a small hum he had long stopped registering. He filled the coffee maker and waited at the counter while it ran. The room told its own story in quiet details. A water stain near the window that had been there when he moved in. A kitchen table steadied with a folded piece of cardboard under one leg. A row of bills in a plastic folder with edges aligned. But Grace's corner of the table was entirely her own. Drawings tacked to the wall in neat rows, no overlap, every single one showing the same 2 figures, tall and small, doing ordinary things together. Walking somewhere. Standing beside a car. Sitting at a table. He looked at those drawings while the coffee brewed. Grace appeared in the doorway barefoot, biscuit tucked under one arm, her hair still pressed flat on one side from the pillow. She crossed the kitchen and wrapped both arms around his leg without a word, the way she did most mornings, confirming he was still there before the day could begin. "Are we going to the place with the pretty cars today?" she asked, her voice still softened with sleep. He put his hand on the back of her head. "Pretty or not, we're about to find out." She considered this with the solemn focus of someone processing a philosophical position, nodded, and went to find her shoes. Elijah was 31, a number that felt neither old nor young on a morning like this one. He had worked for 9 years as a senior powertrain engineer at Meridian Components, a mid-sized automotive supplier east of Detroit, until the company was acquired and restructured, and his position, along with 400 others, was eliminated. The termination letter arrived in March, 3 months and 11 days after the Sunday night in December, when his wife Emily had been killed by a drunk driver on her way home from her mother's house. Grace had been 3 years old. He did not come apart in any visible way. He sold the house, moved into the apartment with his daughter, and took contract work, consulting, specification reviews, freelance mechanical assessments enough to keep them fed and the heat running. And every night, when Grace was asleep, he went to the single-car garage behind the building, not to repair vehicles for money, to build something from nothing, something that had begun as grief wearing the shape of motion and, over 3 years, had become the most demanding, technical work of his life. He called it Emily's thing. Not for sentiment alone, though there was that too, but because the first sketch had been drawn the night of the funeral, when he needed somewhere to put his hands and the only answer available was a pencil and a blank page. He had started with a principle that had lived in his mind for years. A combustion architecture he had never had the institutional backing to develop. That night, with nowhere else to direct the wreckage of the day, he had started drawing. He had not named it officially. He had not filed a patent. He had not shown it to anyone. That ended today. The 1974 Dodge Dart waited in the garage, a $300 acquisition from an estate sale, chosen for its price and its size. Viewed from the outside, it communicated exactly the story its condition implied. Oxidized paint in uneven patches, a dented passenger door, the driver's mirror held in place with a length of wire, the rear seat upholstery torn at the seam, 50 years of neglect had left their mark on every surface. But when Elijah turned the key and the engine caught, the sound coming from beneath that hood bore no relationship to the exterior above it. It was not the ragged noise of a neglected machine. It was measured, layered, quiet in a way that required engineering rather than accident, with a low harmonic beneath the idle that traveled through the floor and could not be explained by any factory configuration that left Detroit in 1974. Grace clapped. "Biscuit likes Daddy's car sound." "I know she does." He put it in gear. 3 years of nights. 3 years of notebooks, filled in pencil, of components sourced at liquidation auctions and machined by hand between midnight and 4 in the morning. Whatever sat beneath that battered hood, Elijah had built it alone. No collaborators, no laboratory, no institutional backing. He had designed it not to sell and not to impress. He had designed it because he needed to know that the engineer Emily had believed in was still there. The Dodge moved through the pre-dawn streets, heading east. Behind its cracked windshield, Elijah drove in silence. The Detroit Convention Center had been remade for the occasion. Banners for the Apex Invitational hung from the light standards along the approach road dark navy with silver lettering, the kind of visual language that communicated exclusivity without needing to announce it. The outdoor competition area occupied the east lot, half an acre of freshly painted asphalt, where entries for the innovative powertrain design category would be displayed and judged. The indoor space held a VIP hospitality lounge and a curated showroom where 3 prototype vehicles from major manufacturers occupied velvet-roped platforms under purpose-built lighting. The competition vehicles were precisely what the occasion demanded. A modified Lamborghini chassis with an electrified drivetrain ran on a separate circuit loop at the lot's far edge. A Tesla prototype with a custom battery architecture sat behind a branded display manned by 3 engineers in matching jackets. A BMW concept engine had been sectioned and mounted on a display stand, all its internals visible and labeled in laser-cut acrylic. Every vehicle in the competition area had staff. Every vehicle had printed technical specifications on premium materials. Every vehicle looked like it belonged to an organization with a real budget behind it. Elijah pulled the Dodge into the registration line. The security attendant looked at the car, checked the registration paperwork, looked at the car again, then back at the paperwork, and waved him through without expression. Grace pressed her face to the window, watching the rows of polished metal pass. "Daddy," she said, "is our car as pretty as those?" "Different kind of pretty," he said. The parking marshal directed him to spot 14. Elijah parked, got out, unbuckled Grace, and set her on her feet. She stood with Biscuit tucked under her arm and studied the event with the wide, untroubled attention of a child who had not yet learned to be intimidated by scale. Diana arrived at 9:15 in a 3-vehicle convoy of black SUVs. She stepped out of the center vehicle with the economical motion of someone for whom that action required no thought. She was 32, the CEO of Vance Automotive, which she had built from a regional parts distributor into a Fortune 100 enterprise through strategic acquisitions, design innovation, and a specific talent for identifying what was undervalued before anyone else noticed. She wore a dark blazer over a simple shirt, hair pulled back at the nape, no visible jewelry. She did not dress for impact. She did not need to. There was something in her bearing that people registered before she said a word. Charlotte fell in beside her, tablet already open, relaying the day's schedule in a low, efficient voice. Marcus Carter, Vance's Director of Research and Development, a man whose title had expanded along with the company over the past 4 years, moved to her other side, walking through the quarterly R&D budget in terms that implied the conclusion he wanted her to reach. Carter noticed the Dodge before Diana did. He stopped mid-sentence, looked at the vehicle, looked at Elijah standing beside it, and then looked at Diana. "What is that?" he said. "They're letting something like that into the competition area." Diana turned. She saw the car. She saw the man beside it, in the process of lifting his small daughter onto the hood so she could see the event more clearly. She assessed the vehicle in a single, comprehensive glance, the kind that processed condition and social standing simultaneously. She looked at Elijah with the detached amusement of someone who had encountered something that did not quite fit the context and found it mildly notable. "I think you may have the wrong address," she said, her voice carrying the short distance between them. The salvage yard is on 12, about 3 miles back. There were people within range to hear it. A few of the technical staff near the adjacent booths caught the remark and responded with brief, involuntary laughter, the kind that arrives without decision before a person can determine whether it's warranted. Elijah turned and looked at her, not with anger, not with embarrassment. He looked at her the way a person looks at weather, noting it, finding it neither surprising nor significant. "Thank you," he said, "but I'm where I need to be." He turned back to Grace, lifted her from the hood, and set her on the ground. Grace looked at the woman across the parking space with the candid assessment of a 6-year-old sizing up a stranger, then returned her attention to Biscuit. Carter moved to the registration table with the confidence of a man who expected his presence to accomplish things. He approached the organizer's desk and, with the practiced ease of someone who assumed his suggestions would be honored, requested a review of Elijah's entry credentials, suggesting that the vehicle might not meet the technical threshold for the primary competition category. Sebastian Howell, the event's chief judge, a compact, silver-haired engineer who had spent 30 years in competitive motorsport before crossing into certification and academic work, picked up Elijah's registration file and read through it. Entry category: Innovative Powertrain Design. The highest technical classification on the card. The largest prize. Carter made a sound that communicated skepticism without forming it into a sentence. Powertrain innovation from a 50-year-old frame. Is he serious? Sebastian closed the file, pressed his stamp to the approval line, and slid it back to the clerk. "The process is the process," he said. Elijah opened the hood to begin his setup. He had his back to the crowd, adjusting a connection near the fuel delivery manifold, when Sebastian walked past on his way to the next registration table. The judge was not trying to look, but the angle made looking unavoidable. He slowed, just slightly. He moved on, reached the walkway beyond, stopped, and wrote something in the margin of the clipboard he carried. A small notation, nothing more, but he had stopped. While Elijah worked through his setup checklist with the efficiency of a man who had rehearsed the sequence dozens of times in an empty garage, Grace had settled into the small fold-out camp chair from the back seat and opened her drawing supplies. She was working with the focused concentration of someone who had a specific vision and intended to honor it. She was drawing the Dodge. But in her version, the car had wings broad, curving ones that emerged from the rear panels and swept upward at the tips. She was applying a particular yellow she called Sunshine Warm in careful, deliberate strokes. A boy from the VIP area drifted over 7 or 8 years old, in a pressed shirt and clean sneakers. He looked at the drawing with the unmoderated critical honesty that children apply before they learn to check it. "Your car is really ugly," he said. Grace looked at him, then at her drawing, then back at him. "Inside, it's really beautiful," she said simply. "My dad told me." The boy had no answer for this and eventually drifted back toward the building. Charlotte, standing 12 feet away reviewing the morning's media log, had heard every word. She looked at Grace for a long moment, then looked at the Dodge. Carter found Elijah alone, without the moderating presence of Diana or the authority of Sebastian. His tone had shifted from the public dismissal of the parking lot to something more precisely calibrated, not condescension now, but the measured delivery of a man sending a warning he expected to be taken seriously. He stood 2 feet from Elijah, voice controlled. "I looked into your history. Meridian Components. 9 years, then out when Dalton acquired the firm. No patents in your name after the restructuring. No institutionnelle affiliation. No lab access." He let a beat pass. "And now you show up here and register for the highest technical category on the card." Elijah kept his hands on his work, connecting the data logger to the ECU output port. He did not respond. "I'm giving you the professional courtesy of a clear picture," Carter continued. "Diana does not spend time on things that don't scale. Whatever you've built, even if it's legitimate, even if it's interesting on some level, you're not positioned to take it anywhere. No infrastructure, no credibility. Walk away before the first round evaluation. Save yourself the record of a rejection." Elijah set down the cable and turned to look at Carter directly. "I'm here to compete," he said. "Not to ask your permission." Carter studied him for a moment. Then he adjusted his jacket and turned to go. At the edge of the row, he paused without turning around. "You'll regret staying." The flatness in it was more specific than a general warning. Sebastian returned later under the stated purpose of collecting supplementary documentation. He spent more time than documentation required, standing at a conversational distance, looking at the engine bay with his clipboard held low. "I'm not trying to intrude," he said quietly, "but that block configuration, I've never encountered a profile like it in any production or prototype literature. Did you design this from the ground up?" "Yes," Elijah said. "Working from existing principles? Or did you develop a new combustion architecture? New thermal management principle? The combustion chamber geometry is original. The fuel injection pathway is original. The electronic control logic is original. Anyone working with you? Co-designers, consultants, academic access?" "Just me. Garage behind my apartment, 12-amp circuit." Sebastian wrote on the clipboard for nearly 20 seconds before capping his pen. Diana, meanwhile, had positioned herself near the window of the hospitality lounge with a sightline to the competition area. She was not consciously watching Spot 14, but when Charlotte came to her shoulder and repeated, quietly and without editorializing, the exact exchange between Grace and the boy from the VIP area, Diana turned from the window. She said inside, "It's beautiful," word for word. Diana was quiet for a moment, and Sebastian was at that vehicle for how long? 15 minutes. Longer than any other entry. Diana looked back through the glass toward Spot 14. The expression she wore was not the same as the one from the parking lot. That one had been automatic, unexamined, reflexive. This was something several degrees different. A recalibration she had not yet decided what to do with. The preliminary evaluation round began at 2 in the afternoon. Elijah's display was the simplest in the row, no printed materials, no backing board, no staff. Just Grace in her folding chair with her drawing pad, and Elijah and the Dodge. When he started the engine for the demonstration, the sound crossed the ambient noise of the lot with a quality that was immediately different from every other running motor present. Not louder, more structured. Something in it that made nearby engineers register it before they had consciously decided to listen. A young engineer from the booth 2 spaces down leaned toward his colleague, keeping his voice low. "That frequency signature," he said, "that's not a conventional combustion pattern." His colleague was already looking. At the far edge of the lot, Carter stood with his phone to his ear. His eyes moved across the crowd, reading reactions. He spoke into the phone for 90 seconds, listened, ended the call, and put the phone in his jacket pocket without a change of expression. The request came through official channels, which was the most efficient way for it to avoid looking like what it was. A member of the organizing committee, the event's logistics director, a man named Paul Whitfield, who had received a $40,000 sponsorship from a Vance subsidiary for the previous year's Apex event, informed Sebastian shortly after 3 o'clock that a formal review of the intellectual property provenance of Elijah's entry had been requested. The stated concern was the absence of any institutional affiliation, patent record, or documented development history that could independently verify the design's originality. Whitfield framed it as procedural, standard practice in high-stakes innovation categories. Sebastian read the request twice. He understood its origin, even without a name on it. He had been in enough rooms with enough people who made moves like this one to recognize the shape of the thing. "How long would a provenance review take?" he asked. "Up to 48 hours for full verification. The competition window closes tomorrow afternoon." Sebastian set the paper on the desk and looked at it without picking it up again. "I'll notify the entrant," he said. The competition official delivered the news to Elijah in the flat language of administrative protocol. The entry had been flagged for supplementary review. No evaluation determination would be made in the current phase. A result could not be guaranteed within the competition timeline. Elijah stood through the entire explanation with his hands in his pockets and his face unchanged. When the official finished speaking, Grace looked up at her father. "Are we not entering anymore, Daddy?" He crouched down to her level, bringing himself to her height, looking directly at her. "We're still entering. We just have to wait a little longer first." She thought about this. Like waiting for the oven timer? Exactly like that. She accepted this with a nod, looked at Biscuit, and relayed the update in a private whisper. Elijah stood. He did not look for Carter. He did not look toward the VIP area. He turned back to the car and rested one hand on the door frame, looking into the engine bay in the particular way of a person whose connection to what they're looking at runs well beneath the surface. Diana had moved from the lounge window during the afternoon. She was in the outdoor area now, behind the main competition row, and had stopped walking without intending to, because the conversation at spot 14 had caught the edge of her attention and held it. She watched Elijah crouch down to Grace's level. She watched him put his hand on his daughter's head. She watched Grace receive the information, whatever her father had translated it into, with a nod and a glance at Biscuit, and then a return to her drawing. Diana had not made a decision, but her feet were not moving. Charlotte appeared beside her. They had worked together long enough that Charlotte understood when direct conversation was appropriate. "You know this isn't a genuine provenance concern," Charlotte said. "Charlotte." Marcus filed that request through Whitfield, the same Whitfield who has used Vance's events budget every year since the merger. Charlotte's voice was steady, not theatrical. She presented information the way she always presented it. "Marcus is worried. People only move like this when they're afraid of being surpassed." Diana turned and looked at Charlotte. Then she looked back at spot 14. "An engineer with no institutional affiliation," she said slowly, as though working through a calculation out loud. "No co-developers, no lab, no documented history registers for the highest technical category in the country's most competitive automotive showcase." "That is what happened," Charlotte confirmed. "Sebastian spends 15 minutes at his vehicle. A 6-year-old says the inside is beautiful." Diana was quiet for a moment. "Those are not coincidences." She walked to spot 14. Elijah saw her coming. He did not alter what he was doing, closing the data connection on the ECU port and entering the afternoon's idle readings into his spiral notebook, and looked up when she stopped. Diana did not begin with pleasantries. "Tell me the truth. That engine, did you design it yourself? From the first line to the last connection. No institutional support. No lab. Garage behind my apartment. 3 years of nights. Why didn't you file a patent? Approach investors? You had to know what you had." Elijah looked at her steadily. "Filing a patent cost money I didn't have. Approaching investors takes time I was spending on Grace." He paused. "And after my wife died, I didn't build this to sell it. I built it to finish it. Your wife, Emily, she died 4 years ago. This is what I made after." He had not said it to move her. He said it because she had asked a direct question, and it deserved a direct answer. There was no performance around it. It landed exactly as it was, the plain weight of a fact. Diana looked at him without speaking for several seconds. "I want to see the engine," she said. "Show me you're cleared to compete, and I'll show you everything. Then I'll make sure that happens." She turned and nearly walked into Carter, who had materialized behind her without being invited. His face did something complicated when he saw the two of them in direct, private conversation beside the Dodge, without Charlotte, without briefing materials, without any of the channels he had been carefully managing. The sight of it landed on him like something physical. He said nothing. He looked at both of them. Then he turned and walked toward the committee tables without a word. Sebastian Howell was not a man who acted on impulse, but he was equally not a man who waited when he believed waiting was the wrong choice. He had been reviewing the technical documentation Elijah submitted with his initial registration since early afternoon, 47 pages of hand-drawn schematics, annotated calculations, and test log records that had been scanned in sections and uploaded to the competition portal. Most entrants submitted 2 to 4 pages. 47 pages of hand-drawn technical documentation was not a standard submission. It was a record of a different order. He found Diana in the covered walkway adjacent to the hospitality lounge, placed the printed file in her hands, and told her he needed 5 minutes of her attention. She read standing up, on her feet, without sitting down, turning pages at the pace of someone who processes technical material in its actual language. Her expression changed around page 6. By page 11, she had stopped turning pages and was reading a single spread with the concentrated attention she gave to acquisition agreements. She looked up at Sebastian. He wrote all of this himself, every line. I cross-referenced the design principles against the public patent database the academic literature, and the proprietary technical archives I have access to through the certification body. There is no prior art matching this architecture anywhere in the record. This is an original design, and the provenance hold is procedurally valid and substantively baseless. He said it without theatrical weight, the tone of a man reporting a fact. If that hold delays evaluation beyond the competition window, this entry will receive no recognition for what it has genuinely earned. Diana closed the file. I want to see the engine. Right now. The small crowd that moved across the lot toward spot 14 had the unplanned quality of something that had assembled itself. Diana walked ahead. Sebastian came with her. Two panel judges who had been speaking with Sebastian when Diana found him followed without being asked. Engineers from a sponsored exhibit nearby, who had been tracking the social dynamics of the afternoon with professional curiosity, moved in the same direction. Carter followed too, walking with purpose, until Charlotte stepped in front of him at the row entrance and matched his pace without speaking, not giving ground. Elijah watched them come. He was standing beside the driver's door, one hand on the roof, Grace beside him with Biscuit. She watched the growing crowd with the same wide, unhurried attention she had given every other development of the afternoon. Diana stopped in front of the car. She looked at it differently now than she had that morning, not as an object with a social meaning, but as a container for something she had just read 47 pages about. Her eyes moved from the body panels to the hood line to the seam of the engine bay. "Will you show me?" she asked. Elijah moved to the front of the car. His hand found the hood release. He paused there, not for the crowd, not for drama, but because this was a threshold he had not crossed in any public way before. What sat beneath that hood had lived in a private space between himself and Emily for 3 years. After this moment, it would not be private anymore. He lifted the hood. No one spoke. The engine that occupied the bay bore no relationship to the exterior surrounding it. Where the car communicated age and abandonment, the mechanical architecture beneath the hood communicated intention, precise, unhurried, deliberate intention. The engine block had been hand-milled, its surface finish exact. The fuel injection system used a custom-fabricated delivery manifold running aerospace-grade tubing Elijah had acquired from a defense contractor liquidation auction, sourced over 6 months, at prices that made sense on a tight budget. The combustion chamber geometry was unlike anything produced by any major manufacturer, a specific angled configuration designed to reduce thermal losses during the combustion cycle by 38% compared to a standard, reciprocating design. The electronic control unit was built from a custom board incorporating commercial microcontroller components and a self-written control algorithm that Elijah had iterated over 18 months. The entire assembly weighed 22% less than a comparable factory engine producing equivalent output. The silence held for several seconds before the first voice broke it. "Is that thermal barrier coating on the pistons?" An engineer near the front of the crowd stepped closer, not affiliated with any competing team, just a man who recognized what he was looking at. "You applied that by hand?" "Plasma spray process," Elijah said. "I built a small rig for it. Took 4 months to get the bond consistency right. And this injection pathway, you're not running common rail architecture at all." "No. I bypassed the pressure accumulator entirely. Direct electronic metering per cylinder. Adaptive timing. The ECU recalculates injection duration every 17 milliseconds based on real-time thermal sensor input." A second engineer turned to the person beside him. "That eliminates most of the pressure variance that degrades efficiency under variable load conditions," he said, quietly, to himself as much as to anyone else. Diana had not moved. She stood at the center of the semicircle that had formed, looking at the engine with an expression that was not readable in a single word. She looked at it the way she looked at things she understood deeply, not with surprise, but with recognition. "Real-world performance numbers?" she asked. 285 horsepower from 2.1 liters displacement. Fuel consumption 41% below comparable output engines in standardized testing conditions. 200 hours of continuous run log data. He reached into the driver's side door pocket and produced a small storage drive. "All of it is here." Diana looked at it, then back at him. "Why didn't you bring this somewhere sooner?" Elijah looked at her. "Because no one opens the door for someone who arrives in a $300 car." The sentence fell into silence. Sebastian was standing 4 feet away, holding the microphone his assistant had brought over. He did not raise it. Some things do not need amplification. Carter pushed forward from the crowd's edge. His voice was pitched slightly higher than his normal register. None of those numbers have been independently verified. This is a controlled display. There is no third-party confirmation of any of these figures. Sebastian turned to face him. I have 47 pages of hand-documented test logs with sensor signatures and timestamps. If you would like, I can display them on the event screen for the full attendance to review together. Data can be constructed. I can verify the thermal dynamics of that combustion chamber. The voice came from a man near the back of the group, compact, mid-40s, hands in the pockets of a plain jacket. He had been watching from the beginning without speaking. 12 years in this field. The thermal efficiency profile visible in that chamber cannot be produced by constructed log data. You cannot fabricate physics across 800 hours of operating records. Carter looked around the circle. He looked at Diana, who was not looking at him. He looked at Sebastian, who had returned to reviewing the drive documentation with his assistant. He looked at the engineers around the open hood, who were asking Elijah questions in the focused mutual language of people who are genuinely interested in the answers. He stepped back, then another step, and then he was outside the circle, and then he was gone. Grace tugged at Elijah's sleeve. He looked down. She was pointing at the engine, her voice barely above a whisper. "Daddy, is that the thing you made for Mama?" He crouched beside her. His voice was even, but it required something from him. "That's the one. Does she know you finished it?" He looked at the engine for a moment, then back at his daughter. "I think she knows." Grace considered this with complete seriousness. Then she reached up and set Biscuit on the top edge of the engine bay wall, facing inward, facing the engine. "Biscuit thinks so too," she said. Diana was standing 3 feet away. She heard every word. She turned slightly away from the group, and Charlotte, standing just behind her, saw her shoulders move with a single, controlled breath. Sebastian asked for a brief recess from the afternoon schedule and gathered the panel in the judge's room adjacent to the convention floor. The conversation was short. The documentation was reviewed. The vote was taken. At 4:45 in the afternoon, Sebastian walked to the center of the outdoor competition area and asked for attention. His voice through the event speakers was clear and unhurried. The Apex Invitational Powertrain Innovation Award, the competition's highest technical distinction, carrying a prize of $50,000 and a formal presentation slot before the National Automotive Technology Investment Council, was awarded by unanimous decision of the full judging panel to Elijah Monroe of Detroit, Michigan, for a novel hybrid combustion architecture representing an independently developed original design with demonstrated efficiency and performance metrics exceeding current industry benchmarks in multiple categories. The applause that followed was not the polite kind. It was the kind that comes from people who have been watching something develop across an afternoon and have formed their own conclusions. The engineers from the surrounding booths applauded with their hands raised. The judges who had followed Diana across the lot applauded with the expression of people who had been hoping to see something like this happen. Sebastian stood at the microphone and let the sound run. Elijah stood beside the Dodge. He looked at Sebastian, nodded once, and put his hands in his pockets. Grace tugged his jacket. "Did we win?" "Vivon." She thought about this for a moment, then turned to Biscuit and reported the news in a low, solemn whisper. The crowd around the display thinned slowly, redistributing into clusters of engineers and judges who wanted to ask questions and look closer and have the kind of conversation that had been unavailable to Elijah for 3 years because he'd had no context in which to have it. He answered every question with the same patient precision he had applied to the log data. He was not performing modesty. He was being accurate. Diana let the crowd thin before she walked over. She came alone, no Charlotte, no event staff, no framework that would make the conversation into a professional transaction before she wanted it to be one. She stopped in front of Elijah at a normal conversational distance. Her posture was not the same as it had been at 9 in the morning. She was still entirely composed, still precisely herself, but there was something in the set of her shoulders that had shifted. A small thing, but visible. "I owe you an apology," she said. "What I said this morning about the salvage yard, that was careless." Elijah looked at her for a moment. "You said what you saw. I said what I assumed. Those are different things, and the assumption was wrong. She said it without building anything around it. No self-justification, no architectural defense, just the fact. Elijah nodded. He did not offer "it's fine" or "don't worry about it." He received the apology as what it was, a real acknowledgement, and that, in its own way, was the more respectful response. It treated what she had said as worth taking seriously. A beat passed. "I'd like to talk about what comes next," Diana said. "For the engine. If you're open to it, I'm open to a conversation. Vance has manufacturing infrastructure, distribution capacity, and the R&D integration to take a design from prototype to production in 36 months. We also have the legal resources to establish your patent position before any commercial arrangement begins. You would own what you built. That is not negotiable from my side." Elijah was quiet for a moment. "I have conditions." "Tell me." He looked at her directly. "Grace is not affected by any agreement. Any schedule I take on does not change what she needs from me. She comes first. Any arrangement that makes that harder ends before it starts." "Agreed. I want a co-development position, not a sale. If this technology generates licensing revenue, I participate in it as a partner. I can structure that. I need to be in the room on technical decisions, not advisory capacity. In the room, with a deciding voice." "Done." Elijah held her gaze. He read her face not for the surface but for the weight beneath it. And what he found there was not salesmanship. It was the same directness she had brought to her apology, undecorated, just present. "I'll need my own counsel to review any agreement before I sign." "I would think less of you if you didn't," Diana said. Something shifted in the space between them. Not warmth. Exactly, it was too early for warmth between these two people. But the beginning of a working respect, which in practical terms was worth considerably more. Grace appeared beside her father's leg, looking up at Diana with the deliberate assessment of a child running her own evaluation. Diana crouched down, all the way down, level with Grace's eyes. "Hi," she said. "Hi, I'm Grace, and this is Biscuit." "Hello, Biscuit." Diana addressed the rabbit with complete seriousness. Then, "I want to apologize for laughing at your dad's car this morning." Grace studied her with care. "Daddy says the outside doesn't matter. The inside is the real part." "He's right," Diana said. "I know," said Grace, in the tone of someone confirming a fact already well understood. Diana rose and looked at Elijah. He was watching his daughter with the closest thing to an unguarded expression he had allowed himself all day. "She's right," Diana said. "I know," he said. The professional consequences for Carter were processed without ceremony later that afternoon. Sebastian delivered the summary in 4 sentences. The request submitted through the event's logistics channel had been reviewed and found to constitute an improper interference in the evaluation process in violation of the competition's conflict of interest protocols. Carter's honorary judging credential was revoked immediately. He was requested not to attend future Apex events in any official capacity. The decision was final. Carter received this without responding. He gathered his bag from the table where he had been sitting, crossed the convention floor, and walked out through the main exit. The door swung shut behind him, with the ordinary sound of a door closing. Nothing about it was dramatic. That was the appropriate sound for the occasion. The Dodge pulled out of the convention center lot at 6:48, headlights on in the early evening, and joined the highway traffic heading west toward home. Grace was in the passenger seat with Biscuit in her lap, watching the city lights pass. She had considered out loud whether to finish the winged car drawing when they got home or begin a new one, and had eventually reached no firm conclusion on the matter. Somewhere around mile 4 on the highway, she fell asleep with her head tilted against the seat, and Biscuit held loosely in her arms. The radio found a station without Elijah, choosing one the tuner landing on its own, and an old song came through the speakers that he recognized immediately. Emily had played it on Sunday mornings, a particular piano melody, unhurried and mid-tempo, that he associated with the kitchen in the house they had shared. With coffee and the sound of news low in the background, with a version of his life that had felt entirely stable until the night it wasn't. He did not change the station. He let the song play all the way through. It was the first time in 4 years he had been able to do that. The apartment was quiet when they got home. Elijah carried Grace in from the car. She was completely asleep, biscuit still in her grip, and got her up the stairs and into her bed without waking her. He pulled the blanket to her chin, straightened the edge, and stood at the side of the bed in the darkness. "We won, baby girl," he said quietly, to the sleeping child and to the room. Grace's chest rose and fell with the even rhythm of complete sleep. He did not linger. He went to the kitchen, stood at the counter, and let himself be still in the apartment for the first time since 5:30 that morning. The bills were in their plastic folder. The water stain was on the wall. The table was shimmed with the folded cardboard. None of it had changed, but the weight he had been carrying through these rooms for 3 years had shifted by an increment he could not yet fully measure, but could unquestionably feel in the way he stood there. He made a glass of water. He drank it. Then he went to the garage. The single overhead light came on when he pulled the cord. The workbench occupied the far wall, covered in the material evidence of 3 years. Sketches taped to the board above it, edges curling at the corners. Tools in the order he had established by habit across hundreds of nights. The spiral notebook sitting where he always left it, its spine bent and creased from use. He stood in the doorway and looked at all of it for a long moment. He crossed to the bench and picked up the notebook. He turned to the first page of everything, written in pencil 3 years ago in handwriting that was slightly less steady than his usual hand, written on the night of the funeral when he had nothing but a blank page and the need to begin. "For Emily. And for Grace, so she knows I tried." He held the notebook. Then he set it back on the bench, in its spot, at the same angle. He looked around the garage, at the tools, at the sketches, at the empty space where the Dodge usually sat and was not sitting tonight, because the Dodge was parked outside, and tomorrow it would begin becoming something else entirely. For the first time in 3 years, he stood in the garage and did not know what he was supposed to do next. Then he turned off the light. He closed the door. He walked back into the apartment and went to bed. No one who watched Elijah pull into the Apex Invitational that morning would have predicted the afternoon. That was precisely the point. He had spent 3 years doing something real in a room where no one was looking. There were no investors who believed in him, no colleagues who checked in, no professional organization that held space for what he was working on. There was a garage with a 12-amp circuit and a workbench, and a man who showed up every night after his daughter was asleep, because the alternative, not showing up, was not something he knew how to choose. He had not been building toward a showcase. He had been building toward the completion of a promise made in the private language of grief, a promise to finish what he had started for Emily, regardless of whether anyone ever saw it. That he had built something extraordinary in the process was, in a sense, almost incidental. Almost. But in a world that pays close attention to what can be proven, not entirely. Diana had laughed. It was not a vicious laugh. It was the laugh of a person making an automatic assessment, the kind of shorthand that powerful people develop, because the world presents them with a constant stream of information, and some compression in processing is inevitable. She had been wrong. And when the evidence had accumulated to a weight that could not be reasoned around, she did what very few people in her position actually do. She said so, directly, without deflection. To the specific person she had dismissed, without a crowd watching as a motivating factor, without a reputation management calculation running behind the gesture. She said it because she was capable of it. That capacity to look at a mistake without converting it into something more comfortable is considerably rarer than power, and far harder to acquire. Grace had not been trying to be anyone's moral compass. She was 6 years old with a stuffed rabbit and a drawing pad, and a straightforward opinion about her father's car, that she stated without tactics or awareness of its stakes. But children who have been told the truth consistently by the people they love tend to return it without ornament. The inside is the real part. Her father had told her this in small ways across breakfasts and bedtimes and ordinary moments. She would carry forward without knowing she was carrying them. And on a Tuesday afternoon, in a convention center parking lot, she said it to a stranger, and the stranger had nothing to say in response, because it was simply true. The Dodge sat outside the apartment building that night, under the light of a single street lamp, unchanged. Paint still peeling, windshield still cracked, license plate still hanging by one bolt. Nothing about its exterior had been altered by anything that happened that afternoon. It looked exactly like what it had always looked like. But the man who had built what was inside it, that man had, for the first time in 3 years, turned off the light in the garage and gone to sleep without knowing what he would build next. And if you understand anything about what it costs to carry something that far, across that kind of silence, alone, then you understand that this was not a small thing. It was everything.